Welcome to the Unity BootCamp lesson on creating user entities. In this lesson, we'll be using user entities to store the user's progress in the example game's horde mode. The first thing that we need to do is to determine if the user has already created a user entity to store the data. To do that, we'll use the getEntities_by_type request. For this request, we need to supply the entity type as the parameter. Click the JSON response to familiarize yourself with the data that the request will return. In the event that the request returns an empty entities array, that means that the user does not have a user entity for the supplied entity type parameter. In that case, we'll then use the createEntity request to create the user entity programmatically in the example game. This request takes in the following parameters: the entity type, the initial data, and the entity's ACL. Click the JSON response to familiarize yourself with the data that the request will return. Let's head into Unity and get started. Right-click on the scripts folder and select Create C# script. Name the script User Data. Double-click the script to open it. Delete that the user data class inherits from monoBehavior. Then delete the generated start and update methods. Declare 6 private member variables, 2 member variables of type string to represent the entity ID and the entity type, and 4 bool variables to keep track of which level is completed. I realized that a single int variable would have sufficed here, but I wanted to demonstrate saving multiple points of data to a user entity. Declare a public default constructor. In the constructor's body, initialize the member variables. Declare an overloaded public constructor that takes in the entity ID and the entity type as the parameters. In the constructor's body, initialize the member variables. Declare a public property for the entity ID and the entity type. Then declare a public property for the formatted JSON data. Finally, declare a public property for each of the 4 bool member variables. Save the file and navigate to the constant script. Declare 3 public constants. The first one to represent the entity's type. The second one is used to represent the initial user entity data when we create it. And the third one will represent the entity's ACL. Save the file and navigate to the network script. Declare 4 public delegates, 2 to handle the response of the getEntities_by_type request, and 2 to handle the response of the createEntity request. Scroll down to the bottom. Declare a public method called requestUserEntityData. In the body of the method, we're going to check to see if the user is authenticated. If the user is not authenticated, we'll log in a meaningful error message, and if set, we'll invoke the failed callback delegate. If the user is authenticated, declare success callback lambda. In the body of the lambda, log the response data. Then create a JSON object to parse the response data. Get the entities array from the root JSON object. Safety check that the entities array actually contains at least one element. If it does, parse the entity ID and the entity type. Create a user data object and pass in the entity ID and type, then parse the level data. If set, then invoke the success callback delegate. Pass in the user data object as the argument. Note, if the entities array was empty, then the user data object will be null. Next, declare the failed callback lambda. In the body of the lambda, log an error along with the status message, and if set, invoke the failed callback delegate. Invoke brainCloud's entity services getEntities_by_type request. Pass in the entity type constant and the success and failure callback lambdas as the arguments. Next, declare a public method called createUserEntityData. In the body of the method, we're going to check to see if the user is authenticated. If the user is not authenticated, we'll log in a meaningful error message, and if set, we'll invoke the failed callback delegate. If the user is authenticated, Declare success callback lambda. In the body of the lambda, log the response data. And if set, invoke the completed callback delegate. Next, declare the failed callback lambda. In the body of the lambda, log nar along with the status message, and if set, invoke the failed callback delegate. Invoke brainCloud's entity services create entity request. Pass in the entity type constant, the initial data constant, the ACL constant, and the success and failure callback lambdas as the arguments. Save the file and navigate to the game script. Declare a private member variable of type user data. In the awake method, create a user data object using the default constructor. Scroll down and declare a public method called getUserData. In the body, return the user data member variable. Scroll down to the bottom. Declare a private method called onUserEntityDataRequestCompleted. In the body, check to see if the user data parameter is null. If it is not null, then assign the parameter to the mUserData member variable. However, if the user data parameter is null, then invoke the network's createUserEntityData method. Scroll up and find the onAuthenticationRequestCompleted method. Invoke the network's requestUserEntityData method. Pass in the onUserEntityDataRequestCompleted method as the argument. Save the file and navigate to the level select dialog script. Override a public method called onShow. In the body, set the bund's interactability status to correspond with the user entity level data. For instance, all the buttons except level 1 will be disabled on startup. If the user beats level 1, then the level 2 button will become available. If the user beats level 2, then the level 3 button will become available, and so on. Save the file and navigate back into Unity. If you need to perform a manual refresh, do so now. Run the game. Notice that the buttons for the last 3 levels are disabled. Click the Console tab. Notice that we had a create entity request. That is because the entities array that was returned in the getEntities_by_type request was empty. Stop the game and rerun it. Check the console and notice that there isn't a create entity request. That's because in the last session we invoked the create entity request and populated the user entity's data. As a result, notice that the entities array returned in the getEntities_by_type request was not empty. Updating user entities is the next lesson in the Unity Bootcamp.